What's up, Trinity Church?
Hey, welcome to Wednesday's discussion. We are looking forward to discussing these events of Wednesday. A couple of reminders. First of all, just want to make sure that you guys all got the announcement about the cardboard testimonies that we're doing for this Sunday. Those cardboard testimonies, really briefly, are going to be write on a piece of cardboard and taking two pictures. So the first piece of cardboard is, what was your life like before Christ? On the other side of the cardboard, how has Christ changed you, or what is your life like now that Christ has changed you? So we're looking for two photos, and you can snap those two photos and send them to trinitysmyrna@gmail.com. Again, the full explanation from that is in the description here as well.
It also could just be maybe some other testimony after you're a Christian of what Jesus has done in a significant way, answered prayer, changed your life, breakthrough, something like that. So either one. Don't be bashful, Trinity. It's going to be a great opportunity. It's not about you. It's about giving glory to Jesus. That's what it's about. So let's fill those things out, send them in. It'll be a great encouragement. I guarantee it. So thanks for participating.
Yeah, amen. So let's jump in and let's get on board with that. Today, back into our Holy Week discussion. This is Wednesday, so you see on the screen there a couple of different events that are going on. We are talking about Jesus continuing to speak in the temple, as well as the Sanhedrin plotting to kill Jesus. Select passages from Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 21, and 22. Again, before we get into that, you can see all of those readings in the description, as well as those kids' activities pages and all of that stuff. Again, you can always find that stuff in the description. So let's get into this discussion. There's really not a lot going on in this day, especially compared to yesterday, Tuesday, and tomorrow, which is Thursday. There's a lot going on those 2 days, so this is more of a quiet before the storm. But what are some of the things that are standing out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the calm before the storm. It's like you said, there's only, there's just the general fact that Jesus was in and out of the temple through the whole week, and don't necessarily record anything specifically this day. I do want to read where the second thing that you mentioned is that they were plotting against Jesus. I'm going to read Matthew 26, 1 through 5. It's one of the statements that communicates that. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, that was the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24, about the destruction of Jerusalem, and also foreshadowing the end of the world, and then Matthew 25, which is the sheep and the goats. After all that teaching and stuff had been done, Jesus said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." And the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and to kill him. But they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people." And so what this passage kind of did, or this event did in my mind, it just kind of led me to think, well, what's going on here? Why are these men reacting this way to Jesus? I mean, part of me is just like, I can't believe, when you read about how good and how wise and strong Jesus is, it's like, why would anyone reject him? What's actually going on here? We know from other places in John 12, we talked about their place in their nation. It was John 11. And they're fearful. Jesus represents a threat to them, to their accepted way of life, to their own pride, their own morality. All that kind of stuff is functioning below the surface here, which John records in John 11. Here Matthew's just saying that they're plotting to kill Jesus. And so I just want to spend some time in this episode just looking at this response, like what was motivating it, why, and then some cautions for us, and then maybe too we might have a little bit of time to look at pretty much the only person who responded the right way, which again wasn't necessarily an event that happened on this Wednesday, although if you read the Matthew account and the Mark account, it seems like it happens on this day, but probably it happened earlier before Passover, which is the anointing of Jesus's feet for burial. So just getting into this, one of the questions is these men are evil in their hearts, and they have evil intentions to put Jesus to death. And so, one of the questions that's raised in that is, does Jesus know about this? Is he aware? Like, what's going on? Is this evil going to surprise him? Are the events that are happening here out of his control? And the answer to that is no. In fact, everything that's happening during this week is actually happening according to the plan of God. You can read in Peter's sermon in Acts. I think you have that there, Dan, in Acts 2, just as a summary of, as Peter recounts the whole kind of crucifixion, what was going on. You got that? Go ahead and read that.
Yeah, this is Acts chapter 2, verse 23, where, we're jumping right in the middle of that sermon, but this Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. This Jesus is the one you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. Yeah, and so to kind of piggyback on that, there is this overarching idea where certain people are rejecting him, certain people are accepting him, but to dig into a little bit more of why, what makes some people respond in certain ways, and then also to see all of these various events, and certainly man being held responsible, but all of those events under the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, nothing accidental happening, Holy Week. I think we can.
Yeah, so that raises some questions. Obviously, if this evil event is happening by the plan of God, are these people actually responsible for what they did? Are they guilty? Are they blameworthy? And we'll answer that question a little bit later. I think the answer to that question just initially is yes, but we'll get into it a little bit more. But one of the reasons why the authors of Scripture record those statements about the Lord or even Jesus himself being in control of all of the events answers two other questions for us that we want the answer to. Number one is, is this train off the tracks? Are we off the rails here? Has Jesus gotten in over his head? Oh man, he just ends up on the cross, and boy, we didn't expect that to happen. And so, no, the Scriptures tell us that Jesus is in control and that this is happening according to prophecies, so that our hearts are actually comforted to know that God is sovereign even over the evil events that men and women may perform. And so that's actually something that's comforting for us. Like, this isn't out of control. In John chapter 12, this is after he's healed Lazarus, and this is right before, it's actually after the triumphal entry, so it's during Holy Week. We didn't get into this on Sunday and Monday, but Jesus encourages the people that, hey, I'm not going to be here forever. Walk in the light while you have it, which is John 12:36. And then when Jesus had said these things, he departed and hid himself from them. Though he had done so many signs before them, they still did not believe him. So that they didn't believe, so that the word spoken by the prophet might be fulfilled. Lord, who has believed what has heard from us, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? Therefore they could not believe, for again Isaiah says, he has blinded their eyes and hardened their heart, lest they see with their eyes and understand with their heart, and they would turn and be healed. And so, even this isn't just something that Jesus is just control of temporarily. This was a prophecy that Isaiah said that would happen to the Anointed One. The Anointed One would perform these signs and wonders, and the people's hearts would be hardened, and they wouldn't see it. And that's to indicate, as I said, two questions. One is it off the rails? No. And then secondly, the question is, did Jesus fail? Is the fact that many people did not believe on Jesus' fault? Is the fact that Jesus ended up being crucified a sign of his weakness and his ineptitude? And so the answer is, the predestination language that is here in these passages is telling us as readers, as sympathetic believers in Jesus, no, the fact that many people rejected him and the fact that he ended up on the cross, those things aren't actually a demonstration of Jesus' weakness. They're actually a demonstration of Jesus' wisdom and power in performing the plan of God. So those are two questions when we say, well, this strong sovereignty language, it's actually really comforting for us. Now, kind of back to the question, as I said earlier, that's maybe a little bit discomforting for us, is like, so are they blameworthy? Are they, are they responsible for that?
Yeah, and certainly you don't get any whiff that they're not responsible.
Exactly.
Throughout all of Holy Week, the John 12 passage there, 37 through 43, really speaks to this. At the very end there, they love the glory that came from man more than the glory that came from God. This is the reason that's cited for their unbelief.
Yeah.
And this is the testimony throughout all of the scriptures as well.
Yeah.
When someone turns away, rebels against the Lord, they bear the responsibility for those responses, or for those decisions. Yeah, and so you kind of have a compatible thing there. I know you're going to get to that term compatibilism and defining that. But we got to be able to hold those two things in the same category, because, like you were saying, if this thing is totally in the hands of the riot, the crowds who are rioting, if this thing is totally in the hands of Pilate, if this is totally in the hands of the Sanhedrin, then there really isn't much hope for us.
Exactly.
We're really hoping that Jesus is better to responding to what they enforce on him.
Right.
And hopefully it's not too much.
Right.
And so that's what the resurrection would be. But really, as we see in Acts, as we see, really promised in Genesis 3 throughout the whole storyline of the Bible, this is the pinnacle. This is all unfolding. This is one unfolding story, as Jesus is the hero. And so, yes, incredibly comforting, a little confusing, sometimes, troubling for us to process. Sometimes it offends us. Sometimes it assures us, so there's a complicated reality going on here, which is appropriate because it's kind of how we make sense out of the whole universe.
Yeah, I like what you're saying. I mean, don't forget Trinity Church, just to emphasize what Dan said there. We're really narrowing in on Holy Week, and maybe it's like, well, they did this, so Jesus did that, and they pivoted, and then he repivoted, and he ended up winning, because of the resurrection. No. Actually, it's this whole huge story. I mean, you referenced Genesis 3, which I really like. That think about this prediction and this this action in Holy Week, specifically culminating in Jesus' death and resurrection, is literally thousands of years in the making.
Yeah.
Everything from Genesis 3. I mean, you can go to Psalm 22, which was, probably written by David. And, he's 1,000 years before Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, the prophet Isaiah talks about an anointed one whose beard's going to be ripped out. I mean, very minute details about what's going to happen. So again, Trinity, if sometimes this thing is like overwhelming and more than you think you can wrap your mind around, it's like, well, yeah, that's probably how it should be. It's a huge story that God has been working out over literally thousands of years.
Yeah. A comment here from Eric Schneider, who actually I think is Carol Schneider impersonating her husband, but drawing attention to his actions. Jesus' actions all week, where he is calm, under control. We've all seen people who are in tough, pressurized situations. Clearly, it's a pressurized situation for Jesus in the garden, everything. And yet, under control, not anxious, trusting, faithful. His actions, his demeanor, his decisions really demonstrate that he's not feeling a loss of control here.
Exactly, yeah. And it's going to even more so. That's going to be heightened. That's a great comment from the Schneider home, we'll put it that way. It's going to be heightened on the cross in the garden. Peter slices some enemy's ear off. Jesus heals it. He's, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. I mean, it's going to be amazing to see the tranquility and the peace that he has. So I did want to read. This is just worth reading. We read this definition from a theologian whom we trust named Don Carson, and this is a really important part of how we understand this at Trinity Church. This tension between God being in control of all things and us being responsible for our actions. It's not back and forth ping pong, there's a way of holding those two things together with the right tension. And as you referenced earlier, Dan, it's this word compatibilism. And compatibilism is the view that the following two statements, despite superficial evidence to the contrary, are compatible. So I'm going to give you two statements, and they're going to seem like they don't go together well, but they actually are compatible, and here they are. Statement number one: God is absolutely sovereign. That means control over all things. But, here's statement number 2, his sovereignty does not in any way mitigate or loosen human responsibility. Human beings are responsible creatures. That's partially what it means to be made in God's image, is that we're moral agents. Okay, we make decisions, and we're free to make decisions. So we choose things, we decide, we obey or we disobey, we believe or we rebel, all that stuff. But our responsibility never makes God, or in this case Jesus, contingent or dependent on us. And so I think you can see this here really well in this Holy Week. On this day, on Wednesday, those religious leaders decided, we are definitely putting him to death, but we're not going to do it during the Passover. We're going to wait, they were thinking, until after the day of preparation, which would have been Thursday of the following week.
Right.
That's what they were going to do. And so that's the rebellious, sinful decision that they make. And just to illustrate, even in this one, this one situation, they said not in the Passover. Their rebellious decision did not override Jesus' already determined decision that he was going to die on Passover as a symbolic fulfillment that he was leading his people out of slavery. And so he was definitely dying on Passover. As my old fan, I remember listening as a teenager driving the old J. Vernon McGee. Put a like in the the comments down there if you know who J. Vernon McGee is. But I remember him preaching a sermon saying the king was never more kingly than when he died on the Passover. So at Trinity we understand that God is sovereign over the events of our lives. And that is very comforting in the face of tragedy, and it's comforting in the face of failure, knowing that although these things don't seem to be what we want them to be, we can trust that God has a plan and is working out for our good. Incredibly comforting. And at the same time, we have a category for us still being responsible for the actions that we make. And so there's no hint, as you said, Dan, in here. Even Judas. I mean, Judas decided at this time he was going to sell Jesus for money. And that was part of the plan. John tells us that in John 2 and then again in John 6, that Judas was going to betray him, and Jesus knew it. And yet, it's not as if Judas wasn't responsible. He still loved money more than Jesus. And so, compatibilism, certainly really, really important. Just in your general understanding of your life and your view of God and who he is and what he's doing in the world, he's in control of all things, and we're still responsible.
Yeah, so certainly, we're not the first ones to kick this around.
No.
People talk about this stuff all the time,
Mm-hmm.
but we want to talk about it for sure in a way in which it's applied.
Yeah.
Understanding or even thinking that we understand what compatibilism is or what the balance is. People talk about it in terms of balance sometimes, all that stuff. Doesn't do us much good if we're not living according to what we know. That's the whole purpose of any of this knowledge, is that we live out what we know, that our actions are not unchanged by what we know.
Yeah.
As we even look at some of the key characters here, we've got...
Well, can I jump in right before we get to the characters?
Mm-hmm.
And I know you're going to go with an illustration application, but just to even kind of follow your lead there and make the application, here's why compatibilism really promotes godliness. If you are, if you have a view of God's sovereignty where he's in control of everything and humans are not responsible for our actions, then that's called fatalism. And, just whatever happens is whatever happens. Can't blame anybody. There's no right, there's no wrong. It deteriorates very quickly away from actually what the Bible is. On the other hand, if you are so emphasis on the freedom, the free will, quote unquote, of mankind, then it's just going to lead to arrogance or despair. Because if you do really well, it was because of your free choice and you're a great person. Or if you do really bad, you're going to be a person of despair because it's all up to you. And so neither one of those are a biblical picture of what it means to know the Lord, to follow Jesus. So compatibilism is really necessary, not just as a conversation, but to protect us from pride and despair, to protect us from fatalism, those type of things. Compatibilism is a very important principle and concept to understand.
Yeah. And so you see it here, and you see it in your own life when it's pressurized, because it's sort of easy to think that I'm responsible for my actions and that God is in control when everything is, running according to plan.
Yeah.
Everything is calm. It's very easy to hold both of those things in the balance. But then once the pressure starts squeezing in, stuff leaks out. That's not great. And you see that over and over again this week in that refrain. They were afraid of what the crowds would think. They were afraid of what the rulers would think. They were afraid, or they desired the glory that came from man, not the glory that came from God.
Yeah.
And so these things tend to win out, and something happens. Even Peter in the garden. We'll talk about that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Raising his sword and taking matters into his own hands.
Yeah.
Certainly heavy on the responsibility and light on the trusting God's sovereignty.
Not trusting that Jesus was in control.
Jesus literally telling him for 3 years now, or however long it's been, that he is going here to die, and
Right.
to the last minute, there's a trust issue going on there. And so,
And even to your point, moments before Peter does that with the sword, we're getting ahead of ourselves here in the days of the week. Just we're looking for stuff to say. I think because Wednesday doesn't have a lot. No, okay. Jesus knocked everyone on their back. They
Right.
can't. Who are you looking for? And they said Jesus. He said, "I am." Everyone fell on their back. It's like, Peter, you don't need your sword.
Yeah.
But he was, definitely not embracing the sovereignty of God in the moment of his pressure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that's, as we kind of think through what does it actually look like to live in both of those realities, I do think, looking to Jesus, looking at him as, the prototype human, the perfect human man, and following his actions of, bold, accountable, faithful, not anxious. There's like this underlying commitment to truth and justice and mercy, some of those things we talked about yesterday. And there's also a real freedom from caring what others would think, caring about the threats of others, caring about the results of those decisions. And so it seems as though that sharp confidence that as I do what's right, as I'm faithful, everything's going to be okay, because you're living with this higher reality that God is in control of these things. And so I just trying to pull that down a little bit and apply that, because I think it's God's in control. Okay, fine, great. There isn't many Christians that don't at least affirm that with their lips.
Yeah.
And then also on the other side, I do think that compatibilism is fairly intuitive. Even though maybe we don't necessarily think, or maybe wouldn't answer it that way on a test.
Yeah.
I do think that Christians who are faithfully following the Lord, they're in their word, they're trying to love others, they're trying to share the gospel. You kind of live under this almost intuitive understanding of the compatibility of God, where you are responsible for your actions, and yet you're living under this, this trust, this reign of God. So it kind of makes sense naturally to us, I think.
Yeah. You keep talking about bringing this down into real life, and it just reminded me of 1 Peter 2, where 1 Peter 2, Peter is exhorting the churches to live, and he talks about their work environments, about how they act at work as servants who are subject to their masters, which is 1 Peter 2:18, and when they're treated unjustly and unfairly, which is, Dan, exactly what you were talking about. When life is pressurized, when work is hard, or later in chapter 3 he's going to talk about husbands and wife, or specifically maybe a husband who doesn't obey the word, and that's such a difficult, pressurized situation, or can be at least in many instances. And so he's talking about trials that they're in, and he uses this example from the life of Jesus, Dan, exactly what you were saying. In 1 Peter 2, verse 21, "For to this you have been called, because Christ suffered for you, leaving an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth." So there's the responsibility. Like when you're in a trial, you still shouldn't sin. You shouldn't be deceitful. You shouldn't be angry, whatever the temptation that you're facing would be. Our example is Jesus, that when he was suffering, what did he do? When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued, there's this ongoing action verb there, entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. That's a commentary on the Holy Week. What was Jesus doing on Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, leading up to his death? He was over and over and over again entrusting himself to the Father, and highlighted especially, I think maybe Peter's thinking of the prayer, and again, I'm getting ahead of us in the week here. 3 times Jesus went to check back. Father, are you sure this is what you want? And then he entrusted himself. So, yeah, this is a real, compatibilism is the nitty-gritty of life. You are daily surrendering to the sovereignty and maybe hourly of God, which is awesome. You get to submit and surrender and trust him, and then it shows itself in righteous, moral, responsible living, which would be intuitive. Yeah. And so, it's a really important category. And so this week and specifically this day, is kind of giving us a chance to pause and look at the response of people and why they're responding the way they are, and how does that interplay with the plan of God. It's a good conversation and healthy for us. I did want to talk about one more thing quick, unless you had something.
No, go ahead.
Which was the response of the one besides Jesus, seeing how he continuously entrusted himself, but also looking at Mary, who is Lazarus' sister. And this is the time, again, it's probably not exactly on Wednesday. Some scholars might say that, but it's probably earlier in the week, right after Lazarus was raised from the dead, probably sometime there. She anoints Jesus with the expensive ointment. Because I read Matthew 26 earlier, it is right there in Matthew 26, after the chief priests and Pharisees decide to kill Jesus. It recounts that story. And during that time as well, you see Judas and some of the other disciples complaining that, hey, she shouldn't have done this. And again, Dan, you talked about how if we're trusting Jesus and we're recognizing who he is, we're not going to be afraid of what other people think. I think this is an awesome way for us to respond as we contemplate who Jesus is and what he's done for us. It ought to set us free to generously and exaggeratively, if that's even a word, demonstrate our love and devotion to Jesus. I mean, she took a year's worth of salary. That's probably what that was. It's a very expensive thing. And she broke the bottle and she anointed Jesus in recognition of who he is and what he was about to do. She seemed to be like the only one who was getting it. What's the right response? It's not to be concerned about what other people are going to think. Yeah. It's not to try to protect our honor. I mean, for her to do that was like, it was potentially shameful and disgraceful for her. Like, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? Like, no, the kind of response, in light of the intensity and all the stuff that's happening with Jesus and him giving his all for us and him surrendering himself completely to his Father, the right reserved responses, polite society, isn't the stuff that impresses Jesus. I mean, this so impressed Jesus. Jesus said, I say to you, wherever this gospel is proclaimed, in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. This impressed Jesus. And so Trinity Church, I've heard sermons and there's songs and they're great and they're rhetorical and easy to remember. The whole break the bottle thing, that's what Jesus deserves. That and more. Let's not be reserved in our praise and our love and our devotion. I mean, this is Jesus surrendering his all, completely submissive to the Father for us. Let's not be worried about what other people are going to think. Let's not be like the leaders or Judas, be more concerned with money. The right response, if you get it, it's I'm going to lavishly dedicate my entire life to Jesus. And that will be a response that will please and honor him. I just feel like I'm preaching hard to respond after that, maybe then. But that's a good response.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, for sure. And you see the contrast between, her doing this open for other people to see, not ashamed, versus, going back to one of the few things we know about what's actually going on Wednesday is a lot of secretive plotting, and so there's lots of, you know, there's lots of darkness that tends to hide in darkness, and when you know, when we are devoted, or when you see the light kind of break through like that, it's right. It's like you're saying, he's worthy of it, and so it's appropriate. It makes sense,
Yeah.
and so you know, that's really helpful for us to remember.
By the way,
Yeah.
the kids video we showed last week talked specifically about that. That was a powerful thing, probably worth maybe showing your kids again. We could post that for you. Also, don't forget the cardboard testimonies. That's an opportunity just to publicly display your love for Jesus, about what he's done for you. Don't be bashful about that. And yeah, I guess that's it for me. Anything else from you?
No, that's all we got. Looking forward to tomorrow, Thursday. Again, check out those readings. There's a lot of content for Thursday, so it would really help you if you're able to read through those. Take some time, read through them with your family, get familiar with the passages, and we'll be back here talking about it.
Thanks, Trinity.